Hello and welcome to the Majlis, Ready for Your Liberties Current Affairs podcast focusing on Central Asia. I'm Mohammed Tahir, the host of the Majlis podcast and Ready for Your Liberties media manager here in Washington, D.C. Known as the last dictatorship in Europe, Belarus is in turmoil following the August 9 presidential elections, which the opposition says was rigged in favor of President Lukashenko, who is in power since 1994. The post-election crisis reached the point that now shots are fired, people are killed, a massive number of protesters were taken into custody, but the outreach is growing and more people are joining the protest. These are concerning developments for Central Asian authorities who are also in power for too long, and some of them are soon headed to various election cycles. So what are some of the parallels between them, and what is the reaction of Central Asia about Belarus tell us about their thinking? To discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Erika Marat, Associate Professor at the National Defense University and author of the Politics of Police Reform. Erika is originally from Kyrgyzstan. Temur Omarov, a consultant at the Carnegie Moscow Center, is joining us, who's originally from Uzbekistan. Tohir Safarov, senior journalist with Radio Free Europe Liberties Tajik service, is with us from Prague, along with Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlako Wazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us on this important conversation today. So let's start from this. How's the development in Belarus are reported in your respective countries? I guess we will start with Tohir, for obvious reasons that the Tajikistan too is headed to presidential elections very soon. So Tohir, tell us please what people are talking about Belarus.
The presidential election in Belarus have become one of the few external political events in recent years which Tajiks paid attention, and also especially after the announcement of the results of election on August 9, there were heated debate on social media and Tajik segment of social media, and some experts shared their opinion, and a lot of people also talking about it, and even saying that we have election on October 11 and some kind of situation could happen or will not happen. So the discussion is going on, especially in Tajik segment of social media, but Tajik local media is most of the time avoiding to discuss this development in Belarus. If there is some report or some analysis, it's just about what is going there, and it's just the official news coming from Belarusian state media.
Mm-hmm. And thank you, Tohir. Also, I think you mentioned this earlier, that Lukashenko is in power since July 1994. I guess President Rahman is also one of the longest-serving leaders and has no immediate plans to leave the office soon. So both for the leadership and people, there are striking elements that they can relate to what's going on in Belarus. And also, unlike Lukashenko, Rahman is reportedly in the process of continuing his dynasty with replacing himself with his son, should and if when he decides to step down. Anyway, let's move on. So, Erika, I guess you will be wearing two hats today as a native of Kyrgyzstan and expert on Kazakhstan. So let's speak about Kyrgyzstan first. They are also headed to elections next month, parliamentary elections. The political situation is tense there. So how's the developments in Belarus are seen from Kyrgyzstan?
So it's very interesting how the public in Kyrgyzstan is observing events in Belarus. I think for Kyrgyzstan, where we've seen two regime changes over the course of just one decade, in 2005 and 2010, both sparked by mass protests and both taking place within just hours or within a span of a day. I think the public is wondering, why is it taking so long for the Belarusians to get rid of Lukashenko, and why is it taking for Lukashenko so long to flee the country? Some of the jokes that you'll see in the Twitter space is that if at least, even a third or a quarter of protests that we've seen in Belarus would take place in Bishkek, the regime would be gone by now. And some are observing with great curiosity how protests in Belarus are so peaceful, regardless of brutality of the government. and filled with optimism, with really peaceful and creative protest tactics in Minsk and in large cities as well. So this is the perspective from Kyrgyzstan. And I think, generally speaking, the difference between Kyrgyzstan and Belarus, and also Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan for that matter, and Tajikistan, is that dictators in Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan, they've been in power for much longer and have been able to consolidate their regimes much greater compared to Akayev or Bakiyev in Kyrgyzstan, whose regimes were not as consolidated, not as strong, and who were toppled much quicker than what we see in Belarus.
About Kazakhstan, so I guess there is also an election coming up. I can't recall, parliamentary elections to be held early next year.
Yes, elections will take place in Kazakhstan, and we'll see how that will unfold. In Kyrgyzstan right now, it's an electoral season, very dynamic, lots of political drama. But yes, in Kazakhstan,
Bruce, any thoughts about Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan? I mean, especially Kyrgyzstan even more, has a vibrant political atmosphere. Is there anything to compare the election eve in Kyrgyzstan with Belarus and perhaps maybe Kazakhstan and Belarus?
Wow, Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyzstan is unique for so many reasons, and you just never know what's going to happen. I mean, there's so much controversy already going on with the campaigning in Kyrgyzstan. Two parties were thrown out by the election commission. They got in back through a court decision. There's allegations of vote buying, on and on and on. So there's certainly any number of issues that one or more parties could latch onto, or the public, and say that this is an illegitimate election. And we're still several weeks away from the actual day of election. So, you just never know what's going to happen with that. And then, of course, how the electorate, people of Kyrgyzstan, are going to accept the results of the election once they're announced. So, that's one you just don't want to try to even predict or forecast what's going to happen in Kyrgyzstan in the next month. Kazakhstan, I think, compares a little bit more favorably. As Erica already mentioned, Kyrgyzstan's already seen two changes of power that happened, because of popular discontent in the country. Kazakhstan hasn't seen that, but, they got, even though Tokayev's in power, everyone still knows and understands that Nazarbayev, who's been there forever, is running the country basically, and certainly, or at least has a great say in how the country is run. So that, I would say, that compares a little bit more with what's happening in Belarus, where they just got, enough is enough. You can only stay in power for so long. And we saw that when Nazarbayev transferred the power to Tokayev, that there was a lot of pushback from people in Kazakhstan that they didn't want the same thing. This was a chance where they were supposed to see some change in the country, and they didn't get it. So they seem to identify Tokayev as basically being essentially the front man for Nazarbayev. So I think that would compare a little bit better to what's happening in Belarus, where they see that this is just an entrenched regime that has no intention of changing or having its top people leave the government anytime soon. It'll be interesting. Of course, the coronavirus has kept a lot of people locked down in their homes. But next year, when parliamentary elections come around, it will be interesting to see if there's enough resentment about the way the campaign and the elections are conducted that they might actually get, and probably will get, a lot of protests against the results. Because again, at least Belarus had opposition figures, but in their presidential election, Kazakhstan won't have that. Even though the government's talked about opposition, they're basically talking about creating their own opposition from the top, which will never work.
But you have seen Kazakhstan was also very active with the youth-led activism that was going on throughout, I guess, 2020, this year. So let's see how that is going to figure out. One more thing, though. I guess we are missing how the authorities are responding to this. And I guess Tokayev or Nazarbayev, one of those leaders, I guess, already congratulated Lukashenko. Isn't the case?
All of them did.
All of them?
Berdy
Except
Mukhomedov,
for
I think,
Berdy Mukhomedov.
but all of them. Yeah, Berdy Mukhomedov, because he was different, but all the other ones were very, very quick. Within 48 hours, I think they had all congratulated Lukashenko.
Did those kind of congratulatory messages created any reaction on the ground? I think, Timur, you pay close eye on what people are talking about, at least on social media. Any kind of specific reaction that stands out in terms of what?
Yes, it was interesting to watch how the society in Central Asia divided into two groups: the the so-called leadership who followed the protests and following the protests in Belarus and the society itself. So when it all began on the 10th of August and the results of elections were announced, the first one to congratulate was surprisingly President Xi Jinping from China. But after that, the second was Putin and other Central Asian states presidents. Actually, there was a difference in the texts of telegrams that leaders sent to Lukashenko. Tokayev was very diplomatic and dry with no so-called friendship stuff. He just congratulated Lukashenko with the re-election, and that's all. But even that gesture was not so good at social media. People were saying, why President supports Lukashenko when it is obvious that the results are fake and Lukashenko is not legitimate president. Some same messages I saw in Facebook from Uzbekistan. People really didn't understand why President Mirziyoyev was so quick to congratulate Lukashenko with this victory as well. So I guess if you go to social media and look at the feeds of intellectuals from Central Asia, you would see that they are sympathizing to protesters and they're following everything that is happening here.
I mean, people talk a lot about vibrancy of media in Uzbekistan. Has there been kind of a sufficient coverage of developments in Belarus on Uzbek media?
Yes, actually, if you open some Uzbek media, some independent so-called, in terms of Uzbek realities, not social, but media, you would see that the coverage is objective. For example, Gazeta was reporting very well, reposting from Belarusian media like Tutbay, which is also not state-owned and shows the situation very objectively. And also some bloggers who are getting popular, more and more popular in Uzbekistan are also paying attention to the protests. So the same thing I cannot say about state media, of course. They are only giving just dry information and coverage from state-owned media of Belarus, which is understandable. Yes.
I believe there is nothing really to dig in, Bruce, the way Turkmenistan has reacted to this. I mean, of course, we do not expect any kind of public discussion about what's happening in Belarus, but you said Berdimuhamedov is the only leader in Central Asia who has not congratulated Lukashenko yet. Is there anything to dig in this reaction?
Well, I mean, there's two things here. The most obvious one is that Turkmenistan never reports on anything that might have to do with regime change, period. Especially within the CIS, they don't want to give anyone any ideas that this could work. But beyond that, Belarus-Turkmen relations are not very good because, they're both suing each other right now because of this fertilizer chemical plant that Belarus built. And Turkmenistan doesn't want to pay the money now because they say the quality is bad, and Belarus said they already finished the contract and everything was fine and they deserve to get paid, and so they're both suing each other. And I thought that was one of the reasons Berdimuhamedov initially didn't want to congratulate Lukashenko, is because they kind of got this feud at the moment and really a court battle going on over that. And we know that Turkmenistan needs the money. So, but like I said, probably the first point is becoming more important day by day as these protests go on in Belarus, is that Turkmenistan just is not anxious to ever, both Kyrgyz revolutions, for instance, they didn't report them because they don't want their people to get the idea that this is a way of changing the leadership, or that it's even possible to change leadership by those means.
Right. I'm sure we are going to discuss parallels in more details. It's just not Belarus that's going through this situation. Earlier, Armenia had its own cycle of political change. I guess these are the realities of what we are living in. So how Central Asian countries are similar in some way that could lead to the same problems happening in Belarus. Speaking of problems, how it's compared with those of Belarus? How's the public discourse is compared? How's the opposition groups are compared? Let's continue the discussion talking about these and many other questions very shortly. First, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Erika Marat, Associate Professor at the National Defense University and author of The Politics of Police Reform, Timur Umarov, a consultant at the Carnegie Moscow Center, Tahir Safarov, senior journalist with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Tajik Service, locally known as Radio Azadi, Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlak Owazi. I am Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties media manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing developments in Belarus from the lenses of Central Asia. So we have touched countries who are headed to crucial elections very soon. So what are some of the parallels? Earlier, Bruce was talking about Tajikistan. Perhaps that's a country which can be compared with Belarus because the type of the political structure is there, the type of the elections that they are also headed. Tahir, is there any parallel that you can draw in the eve of elections in Tajikistan with those of in Belarus?
So, as you know, Tajik President Emomali Rahmon is, like Lukashenko, is leading the country more than 2 decades. Right. So he was nominated last week as nominee from Tajik governing party. So people are saying that we have the same issue like in Belarus, but in Belarus they had a better economic situation. And we talked to people in the streets, and most of them were like very brave, even about freedom of speech in Tajikistan. And most of the people said, we asked them why there is these developments in Belarus, and some of the people in the streets say that because if someone stays for a long time on the power, clinging on the power, people will start to hate him, or they won't like him anymore. So it was very surprising for me too. But as you know, there is also people saying that we know that the situation is not good, so the economy is in a bad shape, but nothing will happen in the country. So even the officials is warning against any changes, and if maybe we'll later discuss it, what officials saying about the situation in Belarus.
Maybe just tell us about that, Tahir. I mean, you said authorities are warning. What they are warning about?
As I said, that there is no official comments from the Tajik authorities, but lately I read a very long piece in Tajik official news agency Khobar, and they published this kind of things about the external developments, for example, in Belarus. And there was a very long piece from 2 Tajik professors that I know one of them personally, who never was interested in politics. He said that we should not do something that we later regret, and they say that also Tajikistan will not commit the same mistake twice, because we had a revolution, we had a civil war, and we learned our lesson. And even they warned that Tajik forces, Tajik law enforcement structures are ready to tackle these kind of riots or other demonstration.
Erika, any thoughts in terms of the public discourse in Kyrgyzstan, how it's compared with Belarus in the election eve? Of course, the opposition, I did not deliberately ask the same question to Tahir. There is no point of asking really how opposition is prepared for this, but in Kyrgyzstan it's a kind of different story. So,
I think in Kyrgyzstan, everyone actually hopes that we've learned enough from those volatile regime changes, and we need to learn how to build competition, how to participate in competition through elections, and without having to get rid of presidents between elections or right after elections. And I think generally public knows that unlike Belarus, any change of regime is likely to be accompanied by maybe looting or disturbances, or even conflict, like in June in 2010 in Osh, but also known as ethnic conflicts. So people are really skeptical about revolutions like this or changes like this. But I also think that no one can really predict when this moment can come. And who knows what kind of elections results we will have in October in Kyrgyzstan, if there'll be too many falsifications and pro-regime or pro-corrupt elite or infamously corrupt elite parties win elections by margins that are too wide and not convincing enough, and there'll be something fishy in their victories, I think people will convene, or at least competing political parties will try to convene and will try to, again, engage in street politics in Bishkek and other parts of Kyrgyzstan. But also, I think what's important to note when we compare Belarus to Central Asian countries and other post-Soviet countries is that I think even for Belarusians, the current level of protests were not expected. I mean, everyone knew that there is discontent, that people don't like Lukashenko, people are tired of Lukashenko, but they were also surprised, based on from my conversations with journalists from Belarus, they were also surprised that this sustained protest movement, collective action will take place in Belarus. This was also a surprise for Belarusians. So, we may or may not see similar levels of protests in other countries in Central Asia as well after elections or other political events.
Timur, again, coming back to your expertise on social media, so what's the scenario you would paint in case another rigged election takes place in one of the Central Asian countries? What direction people's reaction might take? What people are talking about? What are the scenarios?
I think that no matter what is happening outside of the country, the situation inside is the main factor for any kind of political movement or protest or any other things that are happening inside of the country. Of course, when people are looking at examples of protests in other countries, they see that this is not impossible, that protests can lead to some kind of success. As an example, in Belarus, we already see that Lukashenko is talking about some kind of a reform that he didn't even hinted on before the protest. Now, right after the protest, he was talking about limiting his power. Yeah, he was talking about constitutional change, and even though it's not a victory of the protest, this is some kind of a success for a very authoritarian regime. And this cannot lead to some kind of inspiration. But at the same time, the leadership of the countries is also learning from the mistakes that Lukashenko did. For example, they I guess now see that if they do fakes, they at least should be realistic. If you had 1.5 hour to watch interview of Lukashenko to Russian journalists, you would see that everything that he's saying is complete fake and not realistic at all. Even though for the people who are not following the news from Belarus.
So Timur, how you come to this conclusion that the Central Asian leaders are learning anything from this?
Yeah, first of all, it is logical for people to follow the situation of other leaders that have the same situation. And Belarus is a 100% parallel, has a lot of in common with the situation in Central Asia. If we compare Belarus to Uzbekistan, of course, it's very difficult, very different. But all of the authoritarian regimes are trying their best to keep the regime, keep the power. And in this case, I guess everyone is looking at the experience of others. And also we have these efficient phone calls. For example, Tajik President Rahmon had a phone call with Lukashenko on the 31st of August. They were discussing the situation in Belarus, and he also congratulated him with Lukashenko with his birthday. So I think that from Belarus, leaders of Central Asian states would learn also that social media today and anonymous messaging apps like Telegram are becoming a very powerful tool when, for example, you don't have an opposition leader, but these tools can help people to organize the movement that even 10 years ago couldn't be imagined. Yeah. And today, this is the new tool for protesters without the leadership.
Yeah, I guess we have seen to some extent in Kazakhstan the way social media kind of facilitated those conversation. Bruce, any general thoughts about Central Asia in terms of parallels in the eve of elections in some of these Central Asian countries with those in Belarus?
The biggest parallel I've seen since watching what happened with what is happening in Belarus is really the historic. In the 2005 Kyrgyzstan parliamentary elections, it was real similar. I mean, it's one thing when you have an opposition leader, and I know that in Belarus that Lukashenko had opponents, but what the protests that are happening now are not really being led by the opposition leaders. They make comments from outside the country. But for the 2005 revolution in Kyrgyzstan, the opposition leaders were always trying. They were like 3 or 4 steps behind the protest and trying to see if they couldn't get control of it, and they never really did until after Akayev had left and been chased out of the country. And so I think that's like one of the biggest parallels I see is that what's happening in Belarus is clearly, mass protest, mass unrest. I mean, just mass discontent. It's not led by anybody in particular. This is just the majority of the people are just sick of it. And that was true what happened in Kyrgyzstan in 2005. I mean, people were just sick of what was going on there, and it wasn't because of one person or one group or one political party getting up there and saying, enough's enough and follow me, because, it just kind of erupted, and so I think that's the biggest parallel that I've seen is Belarus today looks a lot like Kyrgyzstan before the first and during the second round of parliamentary elections and on into the 2 weeks before they finally chased Akayev out of power.
I think we are also kind of running out of time, but some final thoughts, though, maybe to start with Erika. So with all these going on in Belarus and Central Asia, watching, so where our eyes should be going forward, as a number of countries in Central Asia are also headed to the elections. I mean, where we should be looking at?
I think one topic that really needs more attention is how the protesters in Belarus, how brave they are and how they act collectively when they are confronted by the police or special forces. And that's something that I think activists across post-Soviet space are watching, different tactics of how when someone is attacked on the street by police forces or Spetsnaz, OMON in Minsk or in other cities, then there is a crowd that tries to protect that person and take it from the hands of the state and try to prevent arrest. And especially the participation of women has been fascinating, how brave they are. So it just shows that even a strong government with consolidated security structures like in Belarus is not all powerful against the public. And it can be both inspiring and a good lesson for activists in Central Asia and in other post-Soviet countries, in Russia, to see how different strategies of how to sustain collective action, how to make sure that your safety is protected and safety of other activists. So it's a fascinating situation to watch, developments to watch for many activists across the former Soviet space.
Speaking of Tajikistan, Tawhir, I think there are a number of issues. We are not only talking about this particular election that's coming up in October, but there is also kind of unspoken plan that whenever and if Rahmon decides to step down one day, for him the ideal candidate would be his son. So in the context of post-election crisis in Belarus, as a journalist, where your eyes will be as Tajikistan is headed to the elections to determine how all this is coming together?
I think that Rahmon will not give power to anyone, even to his son, but he could learn two lessons. So looking at the Belarusia, looking at his friend Alexander Lukashenko with all his successes in economy and other things, but still they have more advanced economy than Tajikistan. And he could learn that these kind of things will happen even in Tajikistan, because Tajikistan has economy which is in a bad shape and people are fleeing the country to find job abroad, especially in Russia, and now they're hungry, stuck there in the old borders. They can't get home. and 10,000 or even more than 100,000 people are stuck in Tajikistan with no job, can't go to Russia to work, and so it can make him think to change something. But at the same time, we saw that this kind of development in neighboring countries and other countries forced the government, even Tajik government, to stifle opposition, even to how to say, like, even to go against his people, and also to do more to get the all power at his hand to not let happen this kind of demonstration in the country. I think there is just two scenario which I don't know which one will happen.
Okay, we are about to conclude the conversation. Before that, Bruce and Timur, also, I was interested in your opinions of, in terms of the future kind of forecast, obviously, in the context of developments in Belarus. So where your eyes will be, what you will be looking at to see what type of influence the situation in Belarus will have in Central Asia, as they are also headed to elections. I mean, we did not talk a lot about the upcoming elections in Uzbekistan. In our last podcast, we spoke about Mirziyoyev's 4 years in office in Uzbekistan. So it means an election is coming up there too in less than a year. So where you will be watching going forward in Central Asia in the context of developments in Belarus?
Yes, President Mirziyoyev would have an election, and there is no doubt that he will be re-elected for the second term. But I think the protests in Belarus and earlier protests in Russia have shown to Mirziyoyev that he should continue to work with the reforms. And I think right now Mirziyoyev is already thinking about his plan of some kind of a power transition after his second term, because you never know when it is going to come. He's already seen the example of Putin, who started his transition earlier this year, in the beginning of this year. And he understands that this is inevitable for any authoritarian regime, especially for the hybrid regime that he is turning Uzbekistan to. He is making Uzbekistan more complex. And I guess everything that is happening right now in Belarus will show that he should continue with the reforms, so he will not lose the support from the society.
Okay, so where your eyes will be to determine that he is indeed going ahead with those reforms?
I will be looking at new laws that will be not only about the reforms that we've seen earlier, but will change the structure of how the government is working. I will be also looking at how our elections and the period before the elections, the campaign would be working, whether independent candidates will be allowed to participate or not, whether there will be any kind of competition between the candidates. I will also be looking at the rhetoric of Mirziyoyev and what are his plans for the next term. I guess this is the three things that I will question.
So finally, Bruce, so where your eyes will be, and also the second leg to this question is there any country you will be looking more than any other country going forward?
Well, to answer the second one first, Kazakhstan next year in parliamentary elections definitely is the one that especially because they've taken a beating economically. They all have, of course, because of the pandemic. But the Kazakhstan's people aren't used to that. I mean, things were going so well for so long, that it'll be interesting to see what their parliamentary elections will look like next year. Now, more generally across the region, I'd be looking for two things. One, how many young people are these governments going to bring into power? The rulers, the leaders themselves are old people, lived most of their life under the Soviet Union, but you can already see that they're starting to get this transition. They want to at least make a show of, we have young people who spent most of their lives in our independent countries, and they're part of the government, and they understand the needs of the new generation. Now, whether that's true or not is a different thing altogether, but they're trying to show that they're bringing young people in, and they are in a lot of cases, so that there's a general transition which preserves the regime at the same time. And then the other thing is that I think is going to be big is what happens in Afghanistan. And of course that goes on and on. But as the U.S. disengages and as the peace process, such as it is, continues, how does Afghanistan look? Because if Afghanistan is stable, then a lot more is possible in Central Asia. If the situation is like it has been for 40 years, then all of a sudden you got big power interest in what happens. And big power interest, at least certainly in the neighborhood, is not for change. China and Russia don't want to see these governments go down and leave a vacuum that could be filled by Islamic extremists or a government that was more leaning toward introducing religion into the laws of the land and stuff. So, a lot will depend on that too. That, so stable Afghanistan, you probably got a chance for some changes in Central Asia. But if things look really bad, then, Russia and China, I think, would move into prop up almost any government that looked like it was going to fall, except for Kyrgyzstan, perhaps, where they already know that the government can fall and they're still going to maintain their influence.
Also, my intention was to conclude discussion here, but Bruce, just in your final remarks, you also brought in Russia and China. In the context of what's going on in Belarus, Erika, do you expect any kind of move from those superpowers in Central Asia ahead of the elections?
Frankly, I think we tend to overinflate the influence of China and Russia. Of course, they play a role both in terms of soft power or trying to control information and also maybe propping up security agencies in neighboring countries. But look at Ukraine during Euromaidan. There is only so much Russia could do to prevent the collapse of Yanukovych regime. They can meddle, of course, especially Russia, in a more overt way. But there is only so much they can actually achieve in the process of regime change. Over.
Okay. With this, unfortunately, we have to conclude the Majlis podcast right here. It was great to have you, Dr. Erika Marat, Associate Professor of the National Defense University and also author of the Politics of Police Reform. And also big thanks goes to Timur Omarov, a consultant at the Carnegie Moscow Center, Tohir Zafarov, Senior Journalist with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Tajik Service, and Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, for your time and thoughts today.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is from me, Mohammed Tahir, Radio Free Radio Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week, bye-bye.